Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are really excited to be here with all of you tonight to celebrate Life on Other Planets, a memoir of finding my place in the universe. This exciting conversation is with Dr. Aomawa Shields, who is an astronomer and astrobiologist, the Claire Booth Luce Associate Professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of California, Irvine, and a classically trained actor. I'll tell you more about Dr. Shields' biography in a second, but she is the author of tonight's book and in conversation with Dr. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein, who is an associate professor of physics and astronomy and core faculty in women's and gender studies at the University of New Hampshire. You may recognize Dr. Prescod-Weinstein from her appearances at Charis for The Disordered Cosmos, a journey into dark matter, space-time, and dreams deferred, which you can go back and watch on Charis's YouTube. That is a really exciting book that, even if you think you don't like physics or you don't know anything about physics, you will get into that book. And so when we were thinking about how to celebrate life on other planets, I could think of no better person to be in conversation with Dr. Shields than Dr. Prescod-Weinstein, because I think similarly, this book also is an invitation to people who maybe are intimidated by the idea of considering themselves scientists and wanting sort of a door to walk through. And this is a beautiful door to walk through. So thank you both for making science, accessible through the warm invitation, even though it may still be very over many of our heads. It's still a warm welcome for folks who want to know more and who maybe need to see themselves reflected in these fields. So again, Dr. Shields was named a 2015 TED Fellow and is the recipient of the NSF Career Award and a NASA Habitable Worlds Program grant, among others. She's the founder and director of Rising Star Girls, a program dedicated to encouraging girls of all colors and backgrounds to learn, explore, and discover the universe using theater, writing, and visual art, which is so fun and exciting. So if we have any budding astronomers or hopeful astronauts out there, I hope that you will get lots out of tonight. And additional information about Dr. Prescod-Weinstein: she does research in Black feminist science, technology, and society studies. She's also a columnist for New Scientist and Physics World. Nature recognized her as one of 10 people who shaped science in 2020, and Essence magazine has recognized her as one of 15 Black women who are paving the way in STEM and breaking barriers. She is a co-founder of Particles for Justice, and she received the 2017 LGBT+ Physicist Acknowledgement of Excellence Award for her contributions to improving conditions for marginalized people in physics. So there's more to both of these folks, but I know we want to just get right into it because I see that we have a great crowd tonight. Thank you both so much for being here. I will say to folks, we're mostly going to be just sitting back and enjoying this conversation, but do feel free to put questions in the chat if you think of one that you really want to share. And certainly if there are any folks who are in the sciences who have questions, we would love to hear those. But otherwise, please give a warm Charis welcome to Dr. Shields and Dr. Prescod-Weinstein.
Thank you so much for that introduction, ER. I'm so excited to talk with you tonight. So we're just going to chat. I do want to encourage people, if you have questions, to put them in the chat box, and we will try and save some time for questions. So let's just get into it. You're an astrobiologist. Explain what that means. An astrobiologist. I think probably some people are wondering if that means you study aliens, like if you operate on aliens or something like that.
Yes. Well, firstly, I want to thank you, Chanda, for being here. It's been an honor to walk this path with you. We've interacted at conferences off and on throughout the years, and yet it's been a while, and both of us have been able to involve ourselves in writing popular books on top of the research, the demanding faculty research careers that we've had. And I think that that needs to be acknowledged, because I know for me, it was a lot of work. It was a lot of work to make make this book that I have, that I can have and hold in my hands today, and know that I was not able to carve out only all of my time just for the book. It was something that I was doing on top of being a professor and a mother of a young child. And so I'm sure we'll get to that too. But an astrobiology is a relatively new field compared to astronomy. Astronomy has been around, since the beginning of time, and yet astrobiology is maybe 60, 70 years old. And it's the study of the origin, the evolution, and the distribution of life in the universe. So some of the astrobiologists in the world are thinking about how life got started on this planet, Earth, and others are thinking about how widely distributed life might be elsewhere. And there are astrobiologists who are astronomers like myself, and there are astrobiologists who are oceanographers and geologists and glaciologists and atmospheric scientists, and we're all bringing our specific disciplines, our areas of expertise to bear on answering these questions, such as, are we alone in the universe? That's the main question I'm trying to figure out. So yes, I am looking for aliens. And other astrobiologists are not as concerned about whether we're alone. They're more concerned about how did we even get here to begin with? And so the astrobiology encompasses all of those questions and thought lines.
So obviously, I even get, as a particle cosmologist, I get this question a lot. So I imagine you also get it. Do you think we're alone on planet Earth, or do you think that there is life beyond our atmosphere that's not humans in low Earth orbit?
Mm-hmm. When I have gotten this question, I like to think back to a movie that for many people here who might be, especially if you're in your 20s, when I mention this movie, you may say, what movie is that? It's called Contact, and it came out in 1997. And whenever I mention it when I mention it to my students, I get like these quizzical looks, and yeah, that movie came out before all of you were born. And for those who don't know, it's a great movie. It's an even better book by Carl Sagan and his wife Anne Druyan. And Jodie Foster plays the main character, Eleanor Arroway. And when she's asked if we're alone in the universe, the way she responds is, if it's just us, it would be an awful waste of space. And that's how I feel. I mean, we know that there are on the order of 10 to the 22 stars in the observable universe. And even that number, as I say in the book, 10 to the 22, like how do you even wrap your head around that number? But if you go to a beach, and I did not come up with this analogy, it was presented before me and I've kind of glommed onto it. You go to a beach, you pick up a handful of sand, and think about all the grains of sand that are in just the palm of your hand. Now think about the number of stars in our universe is equal to the number of dry grains of sand on all the beaches in the world. And you think about that number, and that gets us in the ballpark of what 10 to the 22 is. And just about every star has a planet around it. And about 20% of those planets are what we call potential, like in the habitable zone, where they may have the conditions that we know life requires on our planet. And there's a lot of like assumptions that go into that. But even 20% of 10 to the 22 is a huge number. So I come back to, again, if it's just us, it'll be an awful waste of space. It's statistically more likely that we're not alone. Now, whether there are other humanoids on these planets, life forms that could stand up and wave to us and, say something, maybe not. The bulk of life on this planet is microbial. However, I would not be any less overjoyed if that life that we find is microbial and not humanoid. I would still consider it the greatest discovery of my lifetime, of life, of all lifetimes.
So I think this naturally points us to a question that I've been kind of wondering about. We're definitely in a moment where people are asking themselves a lot of questions about budget allocations and why people are doing certain things and not other things, and whether the money should be spent. And I think I hear coming from you an answer to the question of why should we do astrobiology? Like, what's the point? but I'm interested in hearing from your perspective, why should we do it? And I don't just mean like, why should a little kid get excited about it and maybe plan to become an astrobiologist? I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. But, why should the taxpayer spend money on it? I think that this is a question that's on a lot of people's minds. I'm curious about how you think about that question, particularly as a recipient of National Science Foundation awards, NASA grants, et cetera.
Yes, and it's an important question that all scientists need to be able to answer. Why is it important to fund our science? We cannot expect to sit in a cubicle and write our papers and think that that alone will allow us to keep doing that for the rest of our foreseeable futures and careers. That's why science communication has been so important to me, that my job as a scientist is not only to do my science, but to communicate to people who are not trained as scientists why what I've done and what I'm doing matters. And I had to write a piece about this recently that it was exciting to me to think about, because in my mind I've already bought in. I've looked at the stars since I was a kid, and it's like I don't ask that question as often as why should it matter? Because to me it's always mattered. However, thinking outside of that, this book is, if nothing else, it's about, let's change the conversation from either or to both and not merely both and, but yes and this, yes and this, yes and astronomy, yes and acting, yes and music maybe, yes and architecture. So it's, yes, we have a lot of issues on this planet that require our attention, and climate change is one of the top in order for this planet to continue to exist. So that requires attention, and we have planets out there that beg to be discovered, and not only discovered, but characterized and explored. And I used to answer this question in the same way that someone answers, like, why would you climb that mountain? Because it's there, but to go further than that, it's, if we were to find out, I recently thought about how much we were able to accomplish back at the time of the Apollo missions, right? So the president at that time of the United States set a mandate to put a human on the moon. Of course, he said a man on the moon. I'm saying human on the moon by the end of the decade. And we were able to do that. And it wasn't all about scientific discovery. Of course, that motivation was political as well. But we were able to do it. And we did it with only a fraction of our country at the table. A fraction of our country was allowed to sit at the table to work on these problems. Think about what we would be able to accomplish if we allowed everyone to be at the table working towards answering the question, are we alone in the universe? I think if we set a goal for answering that question within the next 50 years, and everyone from middle school girls that we serve to people all over the world who identify as a cross-gender or non-binary, and all colors and everyone, we said, we want you all to be a part of this discovery, whether you're trained as a scientist or not. We could do it. And in so doing it, how would that shape us as a species? I think that knowing now that I'm a parent, from my daughter to know that she lives in a universe where there are multiple origins of life, like, I would never regret her knowing that. Her horizon would expand, as I've written about that in the book. And that's something, that the idea of the preciousness of our experience, and also perhaps the universality of our experience, would be even more understood and held in greater awareness. These are some of the reasons why it's important and it matters to look.
So you write in the book, and it was also mentioned a little bit in the introduction, that you founded and lead an organization, Rising Star Girls, that is particularly focused on getting girls of color around middle school age, right, interested in astronomy. And if I remember correctly, the timeline from the book is you founded Rising Star Girls, you got engaged with doing that kind of work, and your daughter came along afterwards. And so I'm curious about that work, and I'm curious about how becoming a parent, becoming a mom of a little girl has maybe shaped the way that you're conducting that work now, post bringing another life into the world.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I'll tell you, being a parent has changed so much of the way that I think as a human being and as a professional in the world. I'm very attuned to the way my daughter talks. It's very important to me that she feel empowered, that she love herself and approve of herself first. As someone who, as you'll read in the book, spent a great deal of my life looking outward for the answer to whether what I loved was okay, the answer to whether I should be in this field or not, thinking that an actual human being held those answers and had that power to determine that. Mm-hmm. And then ultimately, the story is about discovering that that's not the case, that I get to make those decisions for myself, that there's something much more powerful out in the world that I get to work with and feel comforted by, and that can help me walk through those obstacles, and that no one is powerful enough to determine whether or not I should be an astronomer or whatever I want to be. These are the same things I want for my daughter. And I have to watch it because I can be extremely, I'm meticulous as a scientist, and that pays off in a lot of ways in my career. And yet, if you hold on, if I'm meticulous as a parent, that can turn into hypervigilance, where I hear an upward inflection in her voice, and I get afraid that, oh my God, she's going down the road of too many upward inflections that women are historically predisposed to do, and asking a question or saying something as a statement as if it's a question, and I want her to be confident in herself, or if she's not saying something from her chest voice, strong, and so it's like I gotta chill about that much. She's 5. So there's that component of I having in many ways done made a lot of mistakes as a student, and then done it differently in a way that was successful. I want to bring all of what I've learned to her. And what I realize is that it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And she gets to show me who she is, and I get to let her be who she is. And that's the common thread, I think, amongst Rising Star Girls and the work, the experience that I live with my daughter, is letting these girls be who they are, and to know that who they are is essential. It's not merely acceptable, it's essential to their study and practice of science. Growing up, I thought it's the personal was totally separate from my ability to practice science. No one ever asked me how I felt about the problems that I was working on or the exam I was studying. It was can you regurgitate the information? Can you show up for that exam and download all the things you've uploaded, or upload all the things you've downloaded? And it's I yearned for that sense of there being a personal connection to science. Now, that was my perspective, may not necessarily have been the reality. However, I perceived that science was not inherently personal. And I know now that science is extraordinarily personal, and that I need to have that personal connection to show up every day. And so the work that we do with Rising Star Girls is saying, we want you to bring the conversation you had with your family at the breakfast table that morning. We want you to bring whatever obstacles you're facing in your personal life, with your siblings at school, into how you process what you're learning about that star or that galaxy. Because then no one can tell you that poem you wrote about that constellation is wrong. You can't get it wrong. And that has been shown to be really crucial for these girls, that it builds their confidence and their self-esteem in both asking and answering questions. So yeah, the who they are, and the who my daughter is, and knowing that that's some of that is me and my husband and our influence, and a lot of it is who she is and who she's emerging and discovering herself to be.
So thinking about, this question of, your relationship to the science, and the science is personal, particularly for you as a young person. So you were on the list. I think disproportionate number of people in physics and astronomy are people who kind of clicked with it at an early stage in their life. And so the night sky was your first love, and you fell in love with it while growing up here in New England. I'm in New England anyway. And I actually found myself wondering, so you talk about this in the book, you talk about falling in love with the night sky and wanting to be an astronaut. And I wonder, astrobiology didn't exist as a field at that point, right? And certainly the people who were maybe starting to think about that weren't talking about it in a way that would have entered the public sphere. So I'm kind of wondering, do you think that if you had known about astrobiology back then, that you would have been like, yes, this is it, this is for me? Do you think that that was an emerging thing for you? Or, do you, I don't know if destiny is probably a terrible word to use here, but maybe like soulmates.
Yeah.
I wonder, I found myself wondering about that as I was reading.
I don't know. I know that this field, as you say, it didn't exist at the time, or it was in its infancy, and the first exoplanet wasn't found until, a year before I started that first PhD program. So the field of exoplanets was non-existent when I was a kid. And when I went into the PhD program that I started at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, this is the one that I did 1 year of and then left, I was studying galaxies. I was studying spiral galaxies. I had done my undergraduate thesis on star formation in irregular galaxies. And I think I believe that, like, as long as it was something to do with space, I was fine, At least that's what I thought. But if I'm thinking about it a little more deeply, there wasn't that strong pull towards a subfield within astronomy. There was, in undergrad, I was doing these different research experiences. I mean, one summer it was X-ray sources. The next summer it was using a ballistic missile program to test, to pretend shoot things at the Jupiter's moon Europa and see how much stuff came out. And then the irregular galaxies work. So I think what I really fell in love with was the process of doing some kind of research, like asking a question and carrying out the steps to find the answer. To me, it was like a detective story, and I didn't even have to go to these places in space. I could do this from home, with a telescope, or in a library, and with some computer code, that I could learn something. And I mentioned this too, and at Exeter when I was in high school, like that I could measure something about Jupiter's moons with a telescope, like on the ground, and measure something in space gave me an extraordinary sense of satisfaction. But I'm really glad. I think it was destiny, because when I came back all those years later, and I had to want it bad, because I had a life in LA and a well-paying job, and and a family, and it's like I really wanted to be part of astronomy again, and this field of exoplanets. Like I wanted to know about life elsewhere in the universe. And I think if I had continued as I was before, I may never have found that personal connection that I've mentioned is so critical. It was more about the process rather than the actual discoveries themselves. And the second time around, it was like, I really want to search and know these answers, because this is meaningful for me.
So before I move on, I just want to remind the audience that if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or to put them in the question box. And so now I will say, partly I asked you that question and I started wondering about it. It was a little bit of a setup, right? Because as you know, and people who haven't read the book yet may not know, that you went right from MIT, where you went to college, to graduate school at University of Wisconsin, but then you ended up leaving Wisconsin and taking a very extended pit stop in Los Angeles to do a master's in fine arts in acting. You're a classically trained actor. And so you took a kind of circuitous route to coming around to astrobiology. And so I was kind of wondering if you could talk about, that decision-making process of making that decision to leave, and how that shaped, the way you thought about becoming a scientist when you decided, okay, I'm ready to come back to astronomy, or I need to come back to astronomy. I don't know which of those two it was, or maybe it was both.
Yes. So I did go right into a PhD program out of MIT, and that felt almost unconscious to me. It was that thing where, like, that's what you do. If you're going to stay in pure science, you have to continue on. And I hadn't made that choice actively. I'd gone to a prestigious high school because it had its own observatory. And I had decided at the age of 12 that I'm going to be an astronaut, and like plotted the whole trajectory and go to MIT. But then I stumbled into an audition and acting in high school for a play called Steel Magnolias. And that was it. It was like, wow, I love this too. I love acting. And I was doing play after play after play. Now I'm very stubborn, and I had set myself up with this dream from the age of 12. And so I decided I had to stick with it. And so I went to MIT, stayed with the astronomy dream. And yet again, I came back to this sort of crossroads at the end of undergrad, where I had started taking acting classes at MIT. They actually exist. And I was in an a cappella singing group, and I did plays. And so when it came time to apply to grad schools, I applied to acting grad schools and astronomy grad schools. And I shot for the moon all around with, the acting schools. I applied to like Yale, the Globe, and NYU. And I didn't get into any of those three, but I did get into astrophysics grad school. So I thought I'm going to go do that. And then during that year, this is what I say, I made a lot of mistakes. I don't say that to beat myself up, because mistakes are part of life. And again, had I not made those mistakes, I would not be where I am. One of those mistakes though was again, sort of making that decision unconsciously. Like, I'm just going to do this. The signs are pointing to, this is where I got in, so I'm going to go. And again, when you leave a dream behind, and for me, it was the acting dream, it never goes away. The dreams, they catch up. And sometimes the way that they make themselves known is direct, like physical, like a physical feeling in the gut. And that's what it was for me. This gnawing sense that I was doing something I was not doing the thing that I needed to be doing, or that I had was not fully expressing myself. They don't go away. And so like during that first year in that PhD program, I was daydreaming. I was thinking about who was nominated for Best Actor or Best Actress, what's going up for Best Picture. And my cohort, there were 4 of us, and 3 of them all lived in one house that they called Astro House, because one of the older students who lived with them was German. So it was like Astro House. And they invited me to live with them. And I said, no. I wanted to live in isolation, like in the top 2 bedrooms of a 2-bedroom top of a house. And it was sort of like that year. I did well in some classes, and then some classes I didn't do well. And all of those, my cohort were working on their problem sets together in that house. And I was over on my own, struggling alone. And at one point I had a professor in this course that was called Basic Astrophysics, which I felt was a contradiction in terms. He encouraged me to consider other career options. And I remember bawling in his office and thinking that, again, like I thought he was all powerful and all knowing, and then he saw through me. And so I kind of took that as the definitive answer there. I had started going to acting school in that PhD program. I found the acting classes on campus. And I was like, you guys can't tell me that I can't do that, and that I'm not awesome at that. So
Right.
I applied to acting schools again and rode these secret buses to Chicago, and I got in this time and got into UCLA and decided to go. Um, and that was amazing for a long time. And that experience, I mean, it felt like playtime at first. It was like, no one's asking me to do problem sets. Like they want me to explore my feelings and, and use them to embody these characters. And then I discovered how hard that is, and how hard it is to learn how to speak in different dialects and how to use my entire body to communicate rather than from the neck up the way I had been for so long. And it was hard in a very different way, but I had a great time, and yet that didn't feel fully like me. And so, you know, I had a couple of great breaks as an actor, and one of them was acting in a film called 9 Lives that went to Sundance. And there was this moment where my husband and I were at Sundance, and we were stumbling over these mounds of snow because we did not observe the memo that most of the people who are like celebrities at Sundance do, where they wear something called ski chic.
Yes.
We were dressed to the nines because we were like newbies and just happy to be there. And so we're like stumbling over snow, and I looked up at the sky and I made out a little star, and it was like shot, like rocked my head back into place of like, oh, like that was another life. And this was, at this point, it had been maybe like eight years or something since I had left. By the time I became willing and went through all the different steps to go back to grad school and started that second PhD program at the University of Washington, it had been 11 years. So like a full solar cycle. And that experience of going back, I mean, there were things that I had never really learned. Of course, I had to relearn stuff that I had learned because it had been so long, but there were things that I never had learned that well to begin with, because I think I had been so divided throughout undergrad. So I worked really hard, and like I knew I wasn't there to play. I wasn't there to mess around. The stakes were high, and I was 34 when I started that PhD program, and I finished at 39. And during that whole PhD program, there was an evolution in how I felt about my place there. It was like, just because I had gone to acting school and then come back didn't mean I had shed that imposter syndrome that I had first started to pick up in the first PhD program, and where I was like, he thinks I don't belong, maybe I don't see anyone around me who looks like me doing this thing. Those feelings were still there. And plus now I had an acting grad degree. So I had another reason to feel like I didn't belong, African-American woman in a field dominated by white men, older returning student, more than a decade older than my peers, and a classically trained actor. So there's like this trifecta of things that fed into the imposter syndrome. But I had a mentor, and this time around, I'm proud of myself because I did all of the things that like helped me be successful in this field. I mean, I sought out mentor after mentor. And anyone listening, like there is no one mentor. It's about a community. Like anyone who has something that you want, whether it's an apartment in a better neighborhood or a fellowship or a degree that you want, you ask them to sit down for 20 minutes to have coffee with you or have a phone call. They're your mentor. They're a mentor. And it's like I was taught as a faculty member to build a mentoring network. And so I have many mentors, and like they don't all fit on a single PowerPoint slide now. I tried to put pictures of them and I can't anymore. And I'm really grateful for that. So she said to me, this particular mentor, your theater background is your superpower. And that a light bulb came on because I thought that I needed to kind of sweep that theater foray into the humanities under the rug because I wanted to be taken seriously as a scientist. I already had these other things that set me apart. Like, don't ask me about my acting background. Like, let's talk about astronomy. And when she encouraged me to really embrace it, I saw how important and how much of an advantage it actually gave me as a scientist. Much of what we do in our careers is talk to students, to other colleagues when we share our work at conferences. And I knew how to do that. I knew how to talk to people. I knew how to introduce myself. I knew how to network. That was what I had to learn to do as an actor. And I knew how to use my voice and use it powerfully. What I had to learn how to do was to answer questions on the fly, because that was something I was not comfortable with. That whole fourth wall, this boundary between the audience and the person performing, that's what I was used to. And in science, there is no fourth wall. People can ask you questions, every moment during your talk, even before it even starts, and I had to kind of train in how to answer those questions and hold myself, keep myself grounded and hold on to myself as those questions came to me, without feeling like I was on the defensive or that there was some kind of a quest to stump me, and realize that this was a conversation. Most of the time they're conversations that people that it's a good thing when they ask questions. It means they care about your work. So that was a long answer, and yet it's the most pivotal part of the story, I think, that you asked about. And so it required a lot of levels to comment on, because this is really what it's all about, is coming back, coming back, and how that evolved.
So, we've been talking a little bit about, this one creative outlet, your scientific outlet, how those things are in conversation with each other. But of course, we're here talking about a book that you wrote also, right? Exactly. And so acting is not your only creative outlet. I mean, I would also say that I think scientific research is in its own way creative, although it's often not legible to the public in those terms. But one of the things that is a recurring, I guess, discourse or theme in your book is writing retreats and going and, being mentored in your actual writing process. So, and I almost feel like it wouldn't be a conversation where I'm doing the interview if I didn't ask some questions about craft, because I'm always deeply curious about people's craft. So I'm curious for this book, was this something that as you were going on these retreats that you were starting to put pieces together that would eventually become this book? Or, I was curious, if you wrote this book on retreat, how that works for you. Every writer has a different way of doing it.
Yes. I love this question. Yes. I love it too. I love hearing about how people write and their process. And there's a book that I'm forgetting it now, but it's I think it's by Mason Curry, and it's a book about writers and their processes, and all from going hundreds of years back. And I'm fascinated by that. I did write a lot of this book on retreats, both retreats that were organized. And Natalie Goldberg is my writing teacher and has been since 2002, and she's had retreats in Taos, New Mexico, and then most recently online. So there were parts, a lot of the most, I'm trying to think, directly parts that actually made their way into the book happened at the Madeline Island School of the Arts. I'm looking at a picture right here that this is our retreat photo that we took while we were there. And at that retreat, which was in 2021, I read, for the first time, I read portions of an early draft of the book. And at the time, I hadn't gotten the balance right between the science and the personal. And we've always felt, all the editors and myself, is that even though this is a book, it's a memoir about a scientist, the personal is what drives the narrative. This never was intended to be a popular science book. It's not a popular science book. And I was very adamant about that. And yet there is science. And if I've done it well, you will almost not know that you're learning science. By the time the book's over, you will know why the sky is blue. You will know why there's certain classes of planets that we're interested in more than others. You will know, what the greenhouse effect is. But I'm not hitting you over the head with like, you're learning science. It's about the process of me learning it and then sharing it. And there are times in the book where I actually talk to the reader directly. And I made that was an intentional way of really kind of bringing the reader into the story and encouraging them to think about this through their own lens. But I remember at that time at MISA, I read a section out loud, and at one point Natalie and others were like, "Stop! You lost us," because there were like 3 pages of me talking about space and the universe. It was going on and on. And I learned, they encouraged me because they were my target audience. Everybody in the room, and none of whom were trained as scientists. They were who I was writing for. So they were the people whose feedback I needed to pay attention to. And even though it was difficult, because of course, I wanted to read and have them like be blown away and be like, you're ready to send this to the editor today. And that was like, it was like version 0.001, of like all the way up to, so many drafts. And what they suggested was, talk about personal, then you bring in some science, then you're going back and then you're coming out and asking the reader something, and so I was able to, and it took a while to get that balance. And then I also took personal retreats. Like one of my favorite places to go on retreat is the Ojai retreat up in Ojai, California. And it's a beautiful space where there's no televisions, no phones, and they serve you breakfast every morning. And it's like a very quiet, secluded, and idyllic. And I wrote a lot of the book there, and also did a lot of edits of the book. Would this be a good time for me to read a section?
If you're feeling moved, let's do it.
I think because, especially talking about the retreats, yes. So this is a section. So when I went there for the first time to the first retreat with Natalie Goldberg, I wrote to her because she offered fellowships for people of color, because I couldn't afford at the time to go to one. And I wrote to her at a PO box, and she gave me a scholarship. So I went there, and it was Taos, New Mexico, and I'll read you. Okay. Coming up the gravelly path to Mabel Dodge Lujan House, I knew I was in for something special. The smooth reddish-brown adobe seemed familiar to something ancient inside me. The smell of sage and pinon, the dry crispness, and the cold air of winter wrapped themselves around me. I dove into the structure laid out before me. Wake at 6:30 a.m., sit zazen, followed by breakfast, a bounty of egg dishes, fruit, muffins, hot cereals. Grab a to-go mug of hot tea and sit on a chair outside before morning class at 9 a.m. In class, sitting meditation, walking meditation, and writing in large groups and small groups. Lunch, nap, open time to wander into town to browse the stores, stare at paintings, write. After dinner, evening class to sit, walk, write. Then the slow walk to bed in Ansel Adams' room, or Georgia O'Keeffe's, or D.H. Lawrence's. They had all stayed here. Their spirits swept through the rooms with the New Mexico wind. I wrote it all in Taos. How I'd loved the stars since I was a child, why I left astronomy, where I was now, what I loved about acting. I asked myself the questions that had toured all the cells in my body for years. As it poured onto the page, some things became clear. The 2 loves were true loves. They each held an entry point and an ignition source. It was no use to try to make one wrong or any less me than the other. Each could trace its own path from my head to my heart. No more proof would be requested. I couldn't yet make sense of it all, or even accept it all in me yet, without question. I was beginning to see that the path I was meant to follow would require that of me eventually. But things were becoming clearer. I believed in the beauty of the universe, and in the power of a story well told through its characters. That was the common thread: story. On stage, the story's characters talked, growled, breathed air. The story of the universe had its own cast of characters: planets, stars, galaxies, light, distance. These characters lived and had fates too.
Wow, I actually love that you chose that selection because it motivated the next question that I had ready for you. Particularly, you really emphasize storytelling and the different modes of storytelling throughout the book, the different ways that you come to storytelling and access it. And I think memoir is such an interesting genre right now. And I think it's going in interesting and new directions, and people are rethinking what memoir is as a genre. And so I was actually curious about the decision to utilize that particular genre for the storytelling that you wanted to do as kind of your opening salvo of me as a writer, right? And I was thinking about this because I actually very distinctly made the decision not to do memoir. That I was like, I will do popular science and personal essay, but I really actually didn't want to do that. And so I was actually very intrigued by someone who made a different choice for me. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about choosing a memoir when you could have done anything, and you include some poetry in the book too.
Yes, yeah. Well, when my agent first reached out to me to ask if I wanted to write a book, and I think he knew about me through the TED Talk, and the TED Talk, which is called "How We'll Find Life on Other Planets," has, in that talk, which is only about 5 minutes long, I think, it's like I talk about the science, and then at the end I throw in a little personal. And I remember with the TED Fellows team, I fought them hard on that because I wanted to be like, no, I am this unusual, non-traditional scientist. I want to talk about that. And they were like, lead with your expertise. Then people will follow you anywhere. And I remember being super upset and, and stomping my feet and going away for a while and finally being willing to do it their way. And they were right. I didn't have to hit people over the head with the fact that I was different. I could say, hey, here's the science. Here's why it's awesome. Here's why, why I know my stuff. And by the way, you're learning this from someone who's also a classically trained actor and loves fashion magazines, and then it was like, I threw it in and it sort of like blew people away for a second. And then it was like, it left them with that curiosity. So when he approached me, I think it was thinking that I was going to write a popular science book. And I said, I want to write a memoir. And he was like, okay. And the reason that I wanted to write a memoir is those are the books that I read. I have been interested in memoir. I can't even remember how far it goes back, but I read a book by Jill Kirk Conway called A Road from Kurain a long time ago. And she was the first female president of Smith College, and she grew up on a farm in Australia. And I was hooked. I've always been fascinated by the personal story of how someone came to be who they are. And that's why the personal and the professional to me interweave so much. And that's, I think, what's been helpful for me growing up as a scientist is breaking down those barriers that exist between the personal and the professional, letting my students know that like I care about how they're doing and how they're feeling, and if they're trying to do something close to work-life balance insofar as it's possible as a graduate student, that it's important that we talk about wellness, that it's important that we start everything, whether I start my teaching, my classes and my research group meetings, we always start with 3 to 5 minutes of secular mindfulness-based meditation practice. To ground us all and get us all on the same page in the space. And it's also to invite everyone to tune in to how they're feeling and how their bodies and minds are connected. Because I went through my life for so long, really not paying attention to my body. It was all was going on up here. And a lot of that was like negative stories I was telling until I finally changed the narrative that I was telling myself. And now I'm really interested in allowing the body to inform my days and my days as a scientist, what I decide to do for my days, that task list. I'm more connected to my body in that way, and allowing it to dictate what I do rather than my mind and my overachieving ego, So that's the personal, that if I didn't share that with the public and with my students, they might think that like I've got it all together and I've always had it all together. And that's simply not the case. And that's what I've enjoyed about Memoir, is that no one wants to read. It's like acting or any kind of play or movie. No one wants to read a story about someone who's, done it all, got it all. They're happy, they're fine, they've always been fine. Like there's no story there. Nor do people usually want to watch a story about people that are totally wallowing in their miserable lives. It's the striving and the trying and the working towards surmounting obstacles. That's the adventure. That's the journey, because that's what all of us do every single day, and the memoirs are stories of that, stories of someone becoming who they are through the ups and downs of life. And so like even books that are written as if they're memoirs and aren't, like Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, which when I read the first chapter of that, it's a story about Vietnam, and it's fiction, but it's not. In that first chapter, which is called, The Things They Carried, is like, I didn't know that people could write like that. That they could write in a way that was so visceral, with such detail, that I couldn't do anything but like have my jaw on the floor by the end of that chapter, and that's the power of believing that someone is going through something, so that's why I love Memoir.
I really appreciate that answer, in part because you actually answered one of the questions that we got. You have a fan in the Q&A. I invite you to have a moment, if you have a moment, to look at it. Naya was specifically asking about being embodied and care-centered and showing up more in scientific academia. So I feel like you got to that in your answer. So I really appreciate that. I do have like a science question that, like, I just had this science question. I think like my favorite science term that showed up in the book was snowball Earth. I loved snowball Earth. So I was just wondering if you could tell the audience about snowball Earth, like what that is.
Oh, yes.
I find it so cool.
It really is, isn't it? And I first discovered it as an astrobiology grad student. So like in our program, everyone, we weren't majoring or getting our PhDs just in astrobiology. We all came from different departments and we're getting a dual title degree. UW is one of the few places that had a dual title degree program in astrobiology. So when we were all done, my PhD was in astronomy and astrobiology. And because of that astrobiology component, we all had to go to different additional core classes. And so there were people from all these different departments, geology and atmospheric sciences and, engineering, and we would sit and learn about these topics relevant to life. And one of them I learned about for the Astrobiology 101 class, it was snowball Earth. And it's this period in Earth's history that happened about 600 million years ago, and before that 800 million years ago. So 600 million years ago, and then 200 million years ago before that, and then even perhaps at like 1.4 billion years. But the ones that I'm interested in and have been are these two most recent ones. And they are periods where we believe the Earth was totally covered in ice and snow from pole to pole. Like if you could observe the Earth from space, you would see it as a snowball. And there's still uncertainty as to how this happened. People think perhaps it was the fact that we had a lot of continent located at the equator at the time. And of course, at the equator, it rains a lot, and rain draws out CO2 out of the atmosphere. And it probably did a lot of that at once and kind of locked it up into rocks faster than volcanoes could outgas it back up into the atmosphere. We have a regular carbon cycle that kind of regulates our temperature. But if a lot of CO2 is brought out of, and first of all, that regular carbon silicate cycle has been thrown out of whack by climate change. So we are no longer in energy balance, but in its pure form, we would hope to be. And a lot of CO2 being drawn out of the atmosphere at that time might have allowed the temperatures to plummet so fast that the Earth covered itself in ice and snow. And this probably lasted for some millions of years, and then volcanoes outgassed over time, even through the ice and snow, and eventually there was a melt and a thaw. We thawed into a hothouse state. And then that got me thinking, when I first learned about that, could this happen on extrasolar planets? And that's really how my graduate dissertation was born.
I love that story. And I think one of the things that the book really does so well is actually helping people understand what the different academic stages are and what they actually look like. It's almost like having like a Go camera on someone's head while they're like navigating, oh, now I have to do my comprehensive exam, and that's a stage. And what is a postdoc? Because most people don't know what a postdoc is. Usually I say it's like a medical resident, because people kind of know what that is. And part of your journey actually is that from a young age, you were very excited about being an astronaut. You really wanted to be an astronaut. You have a moment where you apply for the astronaut training program and you are not accepted. And I just kind of wonder, is that still on deck? Is that something you're still thinking about as understandings of who can be an astronaut and what way they can be an astronaut continues to broaden? Is that something that you're still interested in doing?
Oh my gosh. Probably even like a month ago, I would have said no, because the amount of time I would have to take away from my family to train, at least when I was in the know about NASA's requirements, I understood that it was like 2 years that you had to like undergo this intensive training, some of it in, other countries. And once I, had a child, the thought of like, and even the thought of being on like a 6-month mission to the International Space Station, I think, nope. Or let alone go to Mars for like on an 8-month mission or more, or like an interstellar mission. Like, nope, not unless they come with me. But the other day I was talking to my daughter, and again, she's going to be 6 in November. And we talk about becoming astronauts and how like she can put anything she wants to be. If she puts her mind to it and works hard enough, she has the potential to be whatever. And that's very important for her to know. That's very important to me for her to know. And yet what I realized today is it's also very important for her to know that I can be whatever I set my mind out to be. I told her the other day that, Mommy wouldn't want to be away from you for that amount of time about being an astronaut. And she said, Mommy, you're still young. You can go to space. And I thought, oh my gosh, like.
That might be the last time she says that you're young. So savor it, right?
Like in the next breath, she's talking about how old me and Daddy are, so like, I took my win I took my win when it came.
Exactly.
But it's that thing where, and this is probably always going to be an edge or a conflict for me as a professional woman, a mother, and a person who works outside the home. Is there's always going to be that tension of like, am I home enough? Am I doing enough at home? Am I, and I have to come back to, by showing up in my life, by showing up as the professional person pursuing my dreams, my career dreams, I'm showing her that she gets to do that. That she gets to have her dreams and have a family, that's setting an example for her, that she doesn't need to choose. So it doesn't mean it wouldn't still be challenging for me to make that choice, but I'm recognizing that there's a lot more to it than I once believed. So I'm open to that idea. And I mean, I heard about, there's a woman who's developing balloons to go into high Earth orbit, and I would totally do that. I mean, I would take that ride. It's not the same thing, of course, as really escaping the boundaries of our atmosphere, but it's it's even a much more sustainable way to develop the space race. And so I would want to support that, and it would be incredible to take that flight.
Okay, so I know I'm supposed to invite ER back on stage, and if you all will indulge me for 1 or 2 minutes, there's a question from Barry Rice in the audience, and I happen to know that Barry is an astronomy professor who has an interest in astrobiology, and so maybe you can answer this on the quicker side.
Yeah.
He's curious about what the most likely place for extraterrestrial life is in our solar system, and he's specifically asking about Europa and Mars.
Yeah, I'm Team Europa for sure.
Okay.
Because we know, and of course there might be subsurface water on Mars. Mars does not have the atmosphere capable of sustaining water in liquid form on its surface, but perhaps the subsurface. But we know there's subsurface water on Europa, Jupiter's moon Europa. And we have a mission, the Europa Jupiter System mission. Like, we're going back to Europa to actually drill through the ice and see if there's anything swimming around in there. And we know on Earth, where there's water, there's life. Everywhere there's water, there's life. So I would put my money on Europa.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for giving such us too, and to Charis Book Circle for always being so awesome.
Thank you both.
Incredible questions, Chanda.
This was such an exciting talk, and I feel like so many budding, star explorers are going to be of all ages are probably in the audience, getting excited right now. So, for folks who would like to buy Life on Other Planets: A Memoir of Finding My Place in the Universe, please just click this button at the bottom center of the screen. There is the beautiful cover. I love it. It really does help us when you buy event books from us. So just click that teal button. It's one click. You can also buy Chanda's books from us. Those are, I'll drop that link in the chat. The Disordered Cosmos, A Journey into Dark Matter, Space-Time, and Dreams Deferred. If somehow you missed that event, we would love for you to check out that book and come back to our YouTube and watch that event. We also really would love for you to recommend these books to your local public library or to your academic institution. It's really a form of activism that we encourage. We want, the right is demanding all kinds of wild things of libraries. And so do your part and demand kindly some things of your library. We would love to get more books that we value and are excited about into public libraries. So make the suggestion, request it. It's usually a little digital thing you can do, and say, hey, I would like to see Life on Other Planets in my local library, because it really does help. So thank you to everyone for watching. It's great to have such a beautiful crowd of local folks and folks watching from across the country. So thanks both of you for being with us tonight. I hope you stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.